Hi, in this video I'm going to be talking to you about variables. Before I dive in, I want to say a little bit about overall what this week is about. So this week I'm going to be talking about variables, claims, and validities. Why am I going to be talking about these? Well, evaluating research is hard. You have to take something complex like a study or a set of studies and divide them up into conceptual pieces that you can analyze. This is difficult, and so what we're going to be doing this week is introducing you to some important concepts that you should be looking for and trying to recognize when you see a piece of research. We're going to come back to all of these in more depth later in the course, so think of this as a first pass, kind of a first go at some of these concepts, which we'll return to later. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about variables. What are variables? Well, a variable is something that can take on different values. It's something that varies. So it would be a set of attributes that go together. The values that it can take on would be called the levels. So to give you a few examples to make this a little bit more concrete, suppose I do a questionnaire to the class and I ask you, what's your hometown? That might be a variable. And the different responses people give would be the levels. So someone might say, I'm from Eugene. Someone might say, I'm from Portland, from Fresno, from Beijing. So the variable is your hometown. The levels are those specific values. Another example, suppose there's a race and I measure what place people come in the race. Somebody came in first, someone second, someone third. So the variable is your place and the levels are first, second, third, and so on. Another example, suppose we measure people's height. So that's the variable, and the different possible values of height that are in our data set, like 5'2", 6'1", 5'8", those would be the levels of that variable. So a couple things I want you to notice here, we're going to return to this in more depth later on, is that there's a couple ways that these variables can vary. That's a little meta, but some of them take on discrete values, so something like your hometown, it's just a value, Eugene, Portland, etc. Some of them are continuous, like your height. So I've described this at a level of precision down to an inch, 5'2", 6'1", but height might vary at even a higher level of granularity. It's more of a continuum rather than a set of discrete chunks. We'll get into this more as well as make some other even finer grained distinctions among variables later in the course. I just wanted to call your attention to it now to give you a heads up. Some other important distinctions among different kinds of variables in scientific research, when the variables refer to things that have happened in an experiment, when the variables correspond to empirical data, one distinction is that some kinds of variables are what we would call measured variables. These are variables where the levels have been observed and recorded. So in all of the examples I gave before would probably be measured variables. Things like your hometown, I would have just asked you what your hometown is and I would have observed what you said and recorded it, things like that. Another really important kind of variable in scientific research is a manipulated variable. This is a variable where the researcher actually controls assignment of the variable. So rather than people come in and we measure whatever it is, in this case, the researcher takes an active role and assigns people different levels of the variable. So we might have a study, for example, where we're comparing people who got therapy to people who didn't. And so a variable might be whether or not someone got therapy. The levels are got therapy or didn't get therapy. But in that case, maybe the researcher assigned people to those levels. They said, one person, you're going to get therapy. Another person, you're going to be in our control group. A constant is something that could have varied, could have been a variable, but that's kept at a single level. So it's not a variable, but usually when we point out that something's a constant, it's because we're thinking, well, it might have varied. Constants can be important because in scientific research, sometimes we want to hold things constant so that they don't vary, so that when we see things happening in our experiment, we know not to attribute them to them. So let me make this a little bit more concrete with an example. So this is a made-up example. This is a distracted driving study. So imagine you read this in a news article or in a textbook. I'm going to read it to you. In an experiment on American drivers, researchers asked the participants to use a driving simulator for 1 hour while either monitoring a cell phone for messages or driving undistracted. The average number of accidents was 3.2 for the distracted drivers and 0.9 for the undistracted drivers. Okay, so what are the variables in this description? Well, one variable is whether people were monitoring a cell phone for messages or driving undistracted. So we might call this variable distracted driving. And it has two levels, distracted or undistracted. Although the description doesn't explicitly say this, probably this was a manipulated variable, meaning that probably what happened was that the subjects came into the study and the researchers randomly assigned some of them to just drive, and others, they gave them a cell phone and said, monitor this for messages. Another variable, this one a measured variable, was the accident rate. So the average number of accidents was 3.2 for the distracted drivers, 0.9 for the undistracted drivers. As an aside, I hope this was a very difficult driving simulator, because if you're getting in 3.9 accidents per hour, or frankly even 0.9, that's not very good. So the levels of this measured variable, back to the subject, the levels of this measured variable would have been the number of accidents. This would have been recorded for each subject, and so it would have been a number as low as 0 and as high as who knows how high. Now, in addition to these variables, the manipulated variable, the measured variable, there may be some constants going on here as well. There's one that stands out to me, at least in this description, which is the national residence of the drivers. So this could have been a variable in the study. This could have been a study of distracted driving in different countries in different national settings. But in this study, it was held constant so that the accident rate wouldn't be a result of the different driving conditions or different driving norms in different countries, etc. Okay, let me do another example. This one's now from a real research study. This one's a little bit more complicated, but I think it's kind of a fun one. This is from a study of the visual experience of toddlers. So as background, an important question in studying infant development is how kids' visual experience of the world shapes their learning. So, and in particular, kids who have different kinds of mobility, walking versus crawling, will have different visual experiences. So this was a study that was designed to study that. So the subjects in this study were 13-month-old children. They wore head-mounted eye trackers while moving toward a caregiver. Some were walkers, others were crawlers. The caregivers sat at the end of a little ramp with a toy that was either held low, held around eye height, or they stood with it around eye height. And the experimenters measured how much the infants looked at the caregiver across these different conditions. So here's a little blow up of that figure so you can see in the top left what the headset on the infants looked like. They actually wore a little headset with two cameras. The scene camera would record what they were looking at, and the eye camera would record where their eyes were directed, so you could see what the babies were looking at relative to the scene in front of them. In the top right panel, panel B, you can see an example of what this looks like. So there are all these stripes so that the researchers, when they look at these videos, can tell what's going on and measure things pretty precisely. In the bottom, you see what it looked like. You see in this case, a parent, probably a mother, is sitting and holding a toy at the floor height or the ramp height, while one research assistant is holding the infant to make sure they don't crawl off, and another one is holding the wires up. Kind of cute, kind of interesting. This is what infant science often looks like. So as I said, this is from a real study, and so I want to show you an actual figure from the study. This figure shows across the x-axis, going from left to right, whether the toy was at low, middle, or high position. On the y-axis, the proportion of frames that the infant was looking at the caregiver, and the different colored dots show whether they are walkers or crawlers. So I want you to ask yourself, how many variables are depicted in this figure? What are the variables? And what are the levels of each of these variables? So if you want, pause the video, take a moment, think about it. How many variables are in this figure? What are they? And what are the levels of each of the variables? Okay, so first, which variable or variables were measured? Do you know which variables were measured? Well, in this case, there were two variables that were measured. One was whether the infants were walkers or crawlers. This was not something that was randomly assigned. 13-month-olds, some of them both walk and crawl. Probably the experimenters wouldn't have bothered trying to tell them what to do because 13-month-olds tend not to listen to that sort of thing. So this was probably a measured variable. Another measured variable that this whole apparatus was designed to measure was how often they're looking at their caregiver. And so that was the proportion of frames of the video where the caregiver's face was in view. So these are two variables, they were both measured. What variable or variables were manipulated? Well, in this case, the toy height condition was manipulated. Adults, unlike infants, do take instructions sometimes, and so in this case, the experimenters instructed the caregiver to either hold the toy low, hold it at middle height, or hold it up high, so that they could see how the infants responded to these different conditions. What was a constant in this study? Well, one of the constants was the age of the infants. They were all 13-month-old. This is important because infants develop really fast, and if you had infants of lots of different ages, some of the variability in the study might just be due to the differences among infants. So if you hold that constant, then you have a better sense of what's a result of the experimental conditions as opposed to just differences among different kids. Why is this constant important? Well, I just went over that. Okay. So another distinction that I want to talk about, and this is going to become really important when we talk about measurement next week, is between conceptual variables and operational variables. So conceptual variables, they're also called constructs sometimes. Conceptual variables are abstract definitions. They're the variables in our theories. So an example or a few examples of conceptual variables would be things like depression, working memory capacity, amygdala activation. So these are the variables. They can take on different values, but they're conceptual variables. They're things that we talk about in our theories. By contrast, there are operationalizations or operational definitions. These are the procedures that we use to measure something. So, for example, if our conceptual variable is depression, our operationalization might be the answers people give to a depression questionnaire. If our conceptual variable is working memory capacity, how much can people hold in their current working memory, our operationalization might be their performance on a computerized memory task. If our conceptual variable is amygdala activation, how much this one part of the brain is active during a task, the operationalization might be something called a BOLD signal, blood oxygen level dependent signal, from an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging system. This is basically a brain imaging kind of technique. So this is a really important distinction because in all the sciences, including in psychology, we build our theories around abstractions or concepts, but we have to come up with procedures that measure them. And so often we have both conceptual variables that we're talking about and thinking about, and operationalizations that we're actually doing in our empirical studies. And as I said, we'll get more into these two things and how they're related later on in the term when we talk about measurement. Okay, that wraps it up for variables. Don't forget to answer the concept check questions, and I'll see you next time.